I've got a couple of questions on de-risking. You're all familiar with some of the issues. I was involved with a campaign, particularly in relation to charities and money transfer businesses a few years ago when it was introduced. I'm grateful to the FCA and others for some of the guidance that was issued to try and help those businesses that were, sometimes unwittingly finding themselves in that situation. But in cases where a bank decides that they've got to do an investigation, obviously the ability, because of the legislation, ability for them to prove themselves and know what's going on is quite limited. And I understand the legal ramifications of that. But you could, if you're a charity or an individual affected, you could just get a letter saying your bank account's now going to close. And do you think that people have enough? Do you think the legislation and the scope of what's going on, and there is obviously a tension between trying to target those who are and get those who are breaking the law versus those who are innocent, is there sufficient protection for people to be able to prove themselves otherwise, given the lack of information that they are going to be party to? I don't know who'd like to...
Perspective. We do need banks and other financial institutions to tackle money laundering and financial crime, and that does lead to individuals being unbanked or having transactions refused, and we're aware of that. I have to say I don't think we see these two things as inconsistent. These two regimes do not operate in tension. If banks are looking at this properly, which is taking individual decisions around an individual, rather than bulk decision making, they should be able to take appropriate decisions. Now we see
so
examples.
They're dealing with it on a case-by-case basis.
We would expect them to, because
are they? Do you know if they are?
We do come across examples when they're brought to our attention when it is not clear to us why an individual has been debanked, and we follow those up with banks when those are brought to our attention. Sometimes that leads to facilities being reoffered, but also, and this comes back, sorry,
that are being debanked or de-risked. Obviously some vulnerable sectors. I mean, Rushanara's mentioned money transfer businesses. Pawnbroking is another one.
And entire sectors being de-risked. If banks are purporting to do that for financial crime reasons, we would say they are not doing proper know your customer arrangements, because those are all about knowing the individual, making an individual judgment. So this should never be a bulk process. And this speaks a little bit to that point that we made earlier around it should be non-discriminatory, proportionate, reasonable. There is always this tension that you call out, though, which is the ability to give reasons to people. Because while we do come across cases where we cannot understand on any reasonable, proportionate basis why an individual lost their access to whatever the financial services they were looking for, but in other cases we do come across, actually, we understand entirely why that happened, but equally we understand why that cannot be a reason that is offered to the participant for all sorts of tipping off type reasons. So there is a tension in there, I would recognise.
Obviously followed this very closely and fully understand the tensions. The question really is, what do we do about it? Because it's not fair to those who are innocent, who are caught up in this blanket response, and you can't give us a guarantee that the FCA is doing enough, one, to tackle the blanket response and practice of some banks, despite all the work that's been done over the years. So we need to understand what you can do further to address that. And the second is actually around monitoring, which, you've got 1.1 million prospective customers for financial crime-related reasons. Now, that's interesting. Then there's 375,000 existing customers who are turned away because of these concerns. Who is doing the monitoring to understand what the profile of those peoples are, by nationality, by ethnicity, by social class, by vulnerability, which links to the money mules point, actually. And how do you get to understand where there's actually discrimination going on, both in terms of types of business, but also characteristics? And is the Equality and Human Rights Commission engaged with you in working this stuff out? Sorry.
A brief answer is the key around this for us is better data, so that we can see this. you've seen the statistics you've drawn from our financial crime report was our first cut through that the banks are giving us. We're going to get a great deal more information that comes through following the payment account regulations coming to force on what the banks are doing themselves around refusal of bank accounts. So when we have that, not only is that going to give us a sector-wide view, which is interesting around trends, but it will give us firm-specific views on whether or not they are there are characteristics across that would cause us concern, and all of those features that you've articulated will give us very great concern if we see that operating. So we will have better data. We will be able to respond in a less case-by-case basis, which by its nature we feel it doesn't get to everybody quickly enough. We will get much better data that will allow us to tackle some of those broader societal issues in the right way, and importantly, get the banks to tackle them in the right way too.
Thank you. Chris, we've seen evidence that some economic crime is committed when there's a third-party data breach, BA Ticketmaster, or in circumstances completely out of a bank's control, a fraudster using number spoofing. So what discussions have you had or have been had